My first experience with demons was in college at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. Westmont is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college. The majority of students there when I was a student were white, middle to upper middle class, and mostly from conservative religious upbringings. I was a resident assistant during my senior year, and after going out for a pizza dinner with the other resident assistants and our resident director, we returned to the dorm to find the lights out. This was unusual for a weeknight. A student who was just coming out of the building informed us that a group of students in the upstairs lounge were exorcising a demon from another student. You can imagine our shock and concern. Sure enough, we went upstairs to find all of the lights extinguished, a candle lit in the center of the group, and a group of students huddled around one student with their hands all over him. They were praying loudly and calling to the demon to come out. It was one of those experiences in life in which you're not sure if what you're observing is comedy or tragedy. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or to feel afraid or to feel sad. After observing what was going on for a minute or two and not seeing or hearing any demons, we called a halt to the event and then sat down to hear the story. It turns out that the student had been walking down the hallway, speaking in an unintelligible language and with a very different voice that was not his voice. Some of the other students immediately identified the sound as coming from a demon. So the students who were around gathered together for an exorcism and to say to the demon, "Come out." "Come out," Jesus said to the demons and diseases and unclean spirits and illnesses and powers and principalities. "Come out. Whoever you are, whatever you are, come out of that person so they may be free to live and love in community. Come out." Jesus was all about exorcising, removing that spirit or oppressive force that kept anyone from being free to experience the new community. It is no accident that one of the very first activities Jesus engaged in, according to the Gospel of Mark, was an exorcism. Most of us don't have a great deal of experience with demons. I was talking on Thursday with a group of women I'm very close to in a group we formed more than 4 years ago. I told them I was preaching about demons today and wondered what they think about demons. At least 3 of them are healers of different kinds. They began telling stories about experiences they have had with other people and experiences they have had with healing people. What became clear is that there are healers in the world who don't necessarily believe in demons, but who do believe there are entities that can inhabit people who are living. These are often thought of as souls who were making the transition to the next life, but who got stuck somewhere. When these souls get stuck, they tend to enter into people who are living. What's even more interesting about this is the way an entity can manifest in someone. They can manifest as physical pain, emotional pain, spiritual pain, or in unexplained ways. I listened with curiosity because some of these women have had experiences I have not had. If you haven't yet watched the Disney movie Soul, you might want to check it out. It explores some of these same themes. While I'm not sure that I believe in entities or souls being stuck in transition, I do believe people suffer, and I also believe healing is possible. Where I begin to get uncomfortable and even protective is when people like me, with some measure of authority, try to name themselves as experts in the realm of naming or calling out demons. There was an article in the Tribune this past week about a priest in Madison, Wisconsin, who was performing voter fraud exorcisms and then showing them live on YouTube. He claimed he was doing the exorcisms and live streaming them with the permission of the diocese. It turns out that wasn't true. The diocese said it gave him permission to do an exorcism for alleviation from the scourge of the coronavirus pandemic, which is also interesting. I would have never thought of exorcising the coronavirus. The priest was apparently doing exorcisms aimed at rooting out what he, the former president, and other supporters have claimed were widespread voter fraud. The diocese was upset not because the priest was doing exorcisms, but because they were exorcisms aimed at partisan political activity. When I read that, I realized how differently we think about exorcism and demons. The Tribune article says that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops defines exorcism as a specific form of prayer that the church uses against the power of the devil. The definition of exorcism is broad for them. With that definition, some of us have probably prayed a specific form of prayer like that. But it is dependent upon our knowing who is and isn't the devil, or what is and isn't evil. When we look at the story in Mark that Sarah read this morning, we discover that this particular story speaks in part to the issue of authority. Jesus' teaching in the synagogue establishes his authority, even more authority than the usual scribes and rabbis. The people listening heard Jesus' words differently than they heard the words of the scribes and the rabbis. Most of us know what it sounds like when someone teaches or preaches and we experience their authority. Jesus knew what he was talking about, and he had a presence about him. But the story goes further. There was in the synagogue a person with an evil spirit who began screaming, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God." The evil spirit is using the plural in the first part of that, which is interesting, which could mean the spirit and the person it was in, or it could mean the evil spirits all around, even beyond that one person. the evil spirit identifies Jesus as the Holy One from God. While we might think this means the same as the Son of God or the divine Son of God, it doesn't. These words were more common. They were used sometimes to refer to eldest children or only children. They were the same words used to describe Abraham's son Isaac. Jesus responds somewhat uncharacteristically by harshly telling the demon to be silent. What's odd about it is that the evil spirit was not screaming terrible things. So why was Jesus concerned? Why would Jesus have responded so harshly? Because of the person the spirit was inhabiting. Jesus harshly told the demon to be silent and then ordered the demon to come out of the person. And it says the spirit shook the person and then screamed and then came out. People were shaken up, as you might imagine, as any of us would have been, and then began talking about the authority with which Jesus ordered the spirit out of the person. The news spread about him throughout Galilee. I wonder if the news was the right news. The news was all about Jesus. The invisible one in this story is the person with the evil or unclean spirit. We never hear the name, nor do we hear about the person's suffering, nor do we get confirmation that the person indeed has been healed. What we hear is Jesus' response to the Spirit. The experience would not be much different than if someone came into the middle of one of our services and began shouting like that at me or whoever else might be preaching or leading in worship. We would likely feel upset, scared, maybe repulsed, maybe a little confused. But let's take it a step further. If the one with the evil or unclean spirit stuck around after church, how many of us would be likely to befriend that person or invite them to sit around one of our many tables? It's possible Ray Long would invite that person to lunch at Cafe Vienna, but aside from that, most of us would probably keep our distance. Or we would try to persuade the person to leave, or in these days, we might call the police, though we'd like to think we wouldn't. If you have something that is binding you, oppressing you, keeping you from being yourself, you are less likely to be accepted into community. And that's what I think Jesus was concerned about with evil or unclean spirits. I don't think Jesus minded as much that they identified him. Jesus had a real issue with the harm they were doing to the human they were inhabiting. While I can usually see and feel suffering in people, I am not someone who can identify an evil spirit or entity or demon. I have not been trained in casting out demons, nor is it part of the practice of most Presbyterians. Because of that, I have stayed away from this whole realm. But just because this is not in my area of expertise or in my direct experience does not mean I am not paying attention. I pay very careful attention to the language people use. Evil, demon, devil, principalities, possessed, crazy, mental, brainwashed. These are some of the words people use to describe either something they fear or don't know much about or are convinced are following whatever is anti-God. We have to be very careful in our conversation about what a demon is or isn't and what an evil spirit is or isn't. There was a time in Jesus' day when people thought an illness or disease was a demon or evil spirit. Obviously, the priest in the earlier story thought the demon or demons were those committing voter fraud, which in the recent narrative of the election would mean anyone who is a Democrat. I'm not sure if it's worse to wrongly identify a demon or to not identify a demon at all. When I came out more than 20 years ago, one of my best friends was convinced I was possessed by the devil and committed to praying that the devil would release me. Many women were burned at the stake, having been deemed witches because they weren't willing to conform with what men were telling them they must do and say. Indigenous people all over the world have been killed because they have worshipped in ways that were different and threatening and not understood by those who did the killing. Who gets to say who is righteous and who is evil or demon-possessed or the devil? Jesus, for one. But that is complicated these days because Christians are following very different versions of Jesus. The Jesus that we think we are following is the one who was nonviolent and was gathering and teaching and living what was the first beloved community. No one individual was more important than the community. In fact, so much of the healing Jesus and the disciples did was for the purpose of restoring people to community. In our day, one of the evils I would readily identify is the evil of how we treat people who suffer from mental illness. Mental illness is not demon possession. While the symptoms of some mental illnesses might on occasion mirror the symptoms of demon possession, they are not the same thing. Mental illness is treatable, demon possession is not. Here's what I mean by that. Demon possession does not respond to therapy, to medication, to changing behaviors, to creating boundaries, to treating whole families for generations of harm, to trauma work, or even to spiritual work. Instead of working to restore people to community, we separate, we label, we ostracize, we shame, and we blame those who suffer from mental illness. Our work, our ministry, our call is to seek out people who are hurting and suffering and to invite them back into community. If we spend our days and our time and our energy looking for and labeling all that is evil, including people, we should, at the very least, seek training in performing exorcisms so that we can engage in the ministry of reconciliation. I learned through my conversations that one of the ways you can pray for someone you think might have a demon or an entity in them that is harming them is by praying that the light will draw that force and surround it, or by just simply sending it to the light. I can't emphasize enough how important it is that we avoid demonizing those who suffer from mental illness, being careful to distinguish what is suffering from mental illness and what is demon possession. Sometimes I wish I had the confidence of those students at Westmont, and then sometimes I remind myself that I don't want to live in a world of good versus evil. The problem with living in that world is that we lose sight of the world that God has envisioned. When we divide the world into good and evil, we can justify any war of any kind. We can justify violence of any kind against those we deem evil. We lose sight of the fact that Jesus wasn't waging war of any kind. Jesus was living as light in order to expose what was not light, with the intention of then restoring people to community. The reason for exposing is always to restore that person or that group to community. I've mentioned before that I have a difficult time with the call-out culture in activism. While I believe in speaking truth to power, I don't see how calling someone evil, or a variety of other names, is speaking truth to power. What we are really doing is ostracizing the person in power. How do we speak truth to power with an eye toward restoring the one with the power to community? Everything Jesus did was to get neighbor to love neighbor, to get strangers welcomed into community, to get people to love their enemies. The community was where love and light was lived out. We would do well to be aware of evil and demons and everything that is anti-love and anti-light. But our awareness needs to be in order to engage in the ministry of restoration and healing and reconciliation and inviting people back into community. Amen.